Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. Today in the house, wow, I don't know if you say luminary or awesome or it's my sincere privilege, but Sally Helgesen. Sally, internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. She's been inducted, a goal of mine, into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame, which honors those whose ideas have shaped the field of leadership worldwide. She's also ranked number 3 among the world's thought leaders by global gurus. Her latest book, which we'll talk to in length today, Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a more inclusive workplace, offers practical ways to build more inclusive relationships, teams, and workplaces. Of course, because it's Sally, it soared to Amazon's #1 top seller in its field in the first week of publication. Rising Together builds on Sally's remarkable success with How Women Rise, co-authored with legendary executive coach Marshall Goldsmith, which examines the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women as they move forward in their careers. The rights of that book have been sold in over 23 languages. Other books of Sally's, a limited few because we can't get to all of them. The Female Advantage, Thriving in 24/7, and one of my faves, The Web of Inclusion, a new architecture for building great organizations. For over 30 years, Sally's delivered workshops and keynotes for companies, partnership firms, and associations working in 37 different countries around the world. Sally, so great to see you. Thanks for doing this. Okay, let's get to it. You point out in Rising Together that there are 8 common triggers that undermine our ability to connect with people whose, as you say, whose history and values may be different from our own. Now, you also state that these are everyday triggers and that they're the prime reason men and women end up retreating to what you call gender silos, narrowing their experience and depriving themselves of useful connections. So before we get into some of the triggers, because I'm fascinated by all of them, but we're going to get to 4 today, based on your experience over the last 30 odd years, have you noticed any improvement on the so-called gender silo file? We're going to start there because of your vast and rich experience.
Oh, yes, definitely, Dan. I mean, everything it's been continuous improvement, not always in the public or political sphere, but continuous improvement in organizations. Women have become more integrated into the fabric of organizations. They have become far more confident in their own ability to contribute, especially as leaders. They have greater solidarity with one another. They used to, it used to be sort of the queen bee syndrome that prevailed certainly in the 80s and earlier in the 90s. And men have, of course, become much more comfortable with the idea of being allies and working with women and working for women and having women work for them. So those things were, I started out, I got really started in organizations with this phase of my career, at least in the late 80s. And it was not like it is now. It wasn't like the Mad Men era where I really did get started in my career back in the 60s in the ad biz, but it was challenging enough.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm assuming then there's still a gap and there's a ways to go, hence something like Rising Together. So let's get into some of the triggers. There's 8, but 4 in particular I'd like to talk about. Let's start with the first, managing perceptions. And sort of the subtitle to that particular trigger, we rise together by neither over nor under managing what others think. So you point out, Sally, in the book that the concept of a double bind is really critical and important. Damned if you do, damned if you don't trap that offers really no intuitive way out for many people who are not like me, white, middle-aged male often. And you say women as well as people of color are likely to have been criticized for behaviors that are routinely accepted from men in, they're the dominant group. So what's at the core of managing perceptions, and really from a both sides perspective, what are we doing right and what do we need to improve upon?
Well, I think it is both sides. We'll talk in a moment about men, but for women and for people of color especially, and that includes men and women, also, people who are gay, etc., whatever, whoever is outside the dominant leadership mainstream, often finds themselves being criticized for things that, you're too aggressive, you shouldn't have spoken up, you're very assertive, young lady, that kind of stuff. I mean, I've heard that a lot.
The bossy girl, right? You're a bossy girl.
You're a bossy girl, you're a mean girl,
Yeah.
whatever. And then, people of color, it's often, well, you seem angry, when they just simply voiced an opinion without, seeming to have some heft behind it. So because of those criticisms, we often get overly invested in trying to manage people's perceptions. And I'll tell you how I know this. When I do women's leadership programs, the single most common question I get is this: how can I bring recognition to my contributions and position myself as a leader without anybody thinking that I'm too aggressive, too ambitious, too assertive, etc.? Here's the thing: you can't manage other people's perceptions to that extent. Maybe a person is uncomfortable with having a woman in that role. Maybe you remind him of his wife or his ex-wife. Maybe you don't know what's going on in that person's mind. So what you don't want to do is privilege managing what people think of you. Look, this question is phrased that anybody thinks I'm this. You can't do that.
Mm.
So what you want to do is not privilege trying to manage people's perceptions, trying to second guess them, over being clear about what you're contributing, what you want to achieve, where you think your talents lie, etc. That is what you want to privilege. And then managing perceptions to the extent that you're able to do it, that is less important than that. There's something that we often forget in terms of managing perceptions. And again, I learned this early in my career, which is that people get used to you and their opinion changes. We've all had that. I mean, I've met people I thought, I'm not sure I like that person.
Right.
And, 3 months later, oh God, I was so wrong about so-and-so. They're wonderful. We forget that people, as they get more exposed to us, most people, unless they're very invested in an ideological point of view, will change their mind. And I tell the story in the book, which was one of the things that helped me understand that when I was very young and fairly, the only woman in the room with a company I was working for in the 1980s. I was in a meeting with a lot of senior men, and I had an idea. So I spoke up. I said, I think a good way of handling that would be whatever. I didn't go on and on. I just suggested it, said why I thought it would be a good idea. Absolute silence. No one picked up on it. Meeting went on. And afterwards, my boss's boss came up behind me and said, how do you phrase it? Well, you certainly aren't afraid of expressing your opinion. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I just said, no, I'm not. I didn't say, oh, I'm so sorry, or I wasn't defensive, like I have every right to. I just said, no, I'm not. And then he walked away like, oh, what's wrong with this woman? I thought I was dead in the water there. I defended my boss's boss. Nothing happened. And maybe 6 weeks later, 2 months later, I overheard him talking to a colleague. And he was saying, what I like about Sally is she's not afraid to say what she thinks. So he got used to me and his opinion moderated. And when we swoop in, it's like being a helicopter parent. We don't give the kid a chance to develop.
Right.
When we swoop in and try to, I've got to make sure so-and-so, he thinks I'm too assertive. How can I change that opinion? When we do that, we really undermine other people's ability to learn to get a real understanding of what we can contribute. So this is very, very common. Again, when I coach African-American women in particular, how can I make sure that I'm not perceived as an angry Black woman? guess what? There are probably some people who are going to perceive you as angry because they're frightened of Black people. They don't have much exposure. Their, background or their origin or what they listen to on the news convinces them that they have reason to be afraid. And so they're reacting on that, excuse me, and you can't control that. So all you can do is be very clear about what you're doing. You might ask a colleague, do I seem angry? Well, I'm trying to be, just say what I think. No, you sound fine. So you want to check it that way, but it's really, it keeps us stuck and reluctant to go for what we want and claim our achievements.
It brings up the point littered throughout the book. Of course, you speak to and provide examples of many different cognitive biases that we have on both sides, but also, of course, lots in the leadership space. And it sort of now segues nicely into another of the triggers. What are you trying to say? And in this, sort of the subtitle is, we rise together by appreciating and learning from one another's communication styles. But within that particular trigger, you make a point which is very good to me because it's something I've prescribed to for many years, and that is differentiating one's authentic self with their best self. So, Sally, why should we be on the kind of lookout for this distinction, and what must we do to appreciate and kind of learn from one another's communication styles with that in mind, and the point about those cognitive biases?
Well, I've noticed this. There's been so much encouragement of people to bring your authentic self to work. Now, I understand it. It's important. And that a lot of people, this would be true for women, certainly true for people of color, but particularly for people who are gay or have a different sexual orientation, where they felt like they could not be who they actually were at work. And that's very painful and it's very limiting. So in regard to that, the idea of being authentic is, of course, very important. It helps us to connect, but it needs to be balanced with professionalism. And authenticity is too often used also as an excuse for cognitive biases. Well, I'm just telling it like it is. I don't, this is my point of view, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful to others. It can be hurtful to others. It doesn't further the conversation. So we want to balance authenticity with professionalism. And I think one of the ways we want to do that is, how do we represent our best self? Now, Dan, this plays out in particular with communications, which is this chapter on this trigger chapter on what are you trying to say, plays out very strongly in terms of communications, because often we feel that a speaking style, for example, that isn't as effective as it could be is just us. That's who we are. That's how we are. And that doesn't give us much of an incentive to begin to think, okay, there's a big diversity of people that I'm communicating with in this organization. Age is a big factor here. Big factor around age. So I'm communicating with a diversity of people. So how can I make sure that I am as clear as possible and that I'm representing myself in the best possible way that helps me build the alliances I need, helps other people get the resources they want? So the authenticity can keep us stuck there. Well, I just talk the way I talk. I'm not changing it for anybody. I've worked with this a lot with women because of the business of being concise. There are a lot of times in organizations, men have a fairly short attention span. In my book, The Female Vision, I looked at, how what we perceive, what we notice shapes how we speak, how we communicate, how we see the world. And one of the things I found is that women tend to notice a lot of things at the same time, whereas men tend to notice, this is of course not true for all women and men, but in general, and functional MRIs show this, that women tend to notice a lot. So they will often in their communication offer a lot of background stuff. Here's how I got to this idea. And then I noticed, and then I saw. And if they're communicating in a culture where there's a very short attention span, a lot of men who are very laser focused noticers, as opposed to having the highly active radar that a lot of women have, then they're not as effective as they could be. So I've worked with women on this and coached them, and they'll always say, well, why should I adapt to a male model in terms of communication? It's not what I'm advocating. What I'm advocating is showing up in the best way that you can, not getting overly invested in authenticity, or what our wonderful colleague Marshall Goldsmith calls an excessive need to be me. Love that phrase. Not getting overly invested in that, but really, how do I show up in the best possible way, and not let my commitment to authenticity undermine my effectiveness in terms of communication. This is also rampant when it comes to differences in age.
I really love it because it does speak to the point that leaders ought to be helping their team members just be their best, not necessarily, strive for authenticity. So I couldn't tell you how much I loved it when I came across the trigger. The third of four I want to get to is another trigger, the grapevine and the network. And the subheadline here is, we rise together by knowing how to develop, extend, and leverage our networks. And so you make a really great metaphorical distinction between the addiction and the consequences of the grapevine, the metaphor, versus the creation of a healthy network. So tell us, what's that distinction and why is it so important to erase one of those triggers going forward?
Yeah, in the way I'm defining it, a network, or a healthy network, is a network in which people really are a resource and provide help for one another. They help one another be more visible. They shine the spotlight on one another. They help one another get promotions or position themselves well. So this sounds a lot like the old boys network.
Yeah, really OBNs, right? Yeah.
Its strength, its strong point, and, it continues certainly in some organizations, is that it really helped the people within it to rise and reach their full potential, and sometimes go well beyond what their potential was. But its weakness was its exclusivity. So people who have been excluded from those kinds of networks often end up by default building networks that are far less functional, which I call grapevines, which kind of serve as an information sharing resource, which is important, not diminishing the value of that, which give them relationships that often provide an opportunity for complaint. And I've seen this because I was there in the very early days, for example, of women's networks or of Black employee networks in organizations. And the people felt so shut out that their networks primarily served them as a place to vent, about their experiences and how awful this had been and why they got shut out of this and how they were actually qualified for this position, but this other person got it, which, it's good to have a place to vent and, enlist allies, but we don't want it to stop there. We need to be able to take action. So one of the things that so two things I advocate. First of all, really to examine are the groups that you're part of healthy networks, or are they grapevines that may serve you in a certain way, but don't really move you or the other people in them forward? And the women and Black employees networks, all of the networks have changed tremendously within organizations, and they really do serve now much more as a resource to help their members develop and claim higher positions. But you want to ask for yourself, now, is this a healthy network, or is this a grapevine? Are we mostly complaining? And if we're mostly complaining, how do we turn this ship around and help our grapevine become a healthy network? And it is usually by adapting the ideas of leverage so that we help one another. I give a wonderful example in the book, the Allori Sisterhood.
Yeah.
And it was a group of Black female political operatives in New York State who had been shut out of the dominant, Black network of Black political operatives, which was all men. They were actually shut out of their meetings. So they decided to form their own network. And at first it was a source of emotional support and solace, and also, a place to vent about their frustrations. They did not feel like they were anywhere near to achieving their potential. But what they did was they decided to learn from the Old Boys Network and start promoting one another, start recommending one another. Oh, I saw a job opening for this. You'd be perfect. I know so-and-so. Can I get them to write you a recommendation? Oh, I'm nominating you for this award for the work you did for so-and-so. That kind of thing. They started doing that. It transformed their careers. As they said, we went to door knockers to essential individuals. Corinne St-Pierre, who's the Biden communications chief, the White House communications chief, was part of that. So they really invested in one another's careers. And that's how you know you're part of a healthy network. So let's everybody learn from how the Old Boys Network did things in order to make our own networks, which are not exclusive in the way the Old Boys Network traditionally has been, as effective as the Old Boys Network.
Well, and even so, I mean, we could look from lyric history, and I heard it through the grapevine isn't exactly a nurturing way in which to build a network, is it?
You got it. It's one of the reasons I chose that term. I grew up in Michigan, so that Detroit Motown shaped my life.
There you are. Excellent.
Along with Michigan football and basketball.
Okay, so the fourth I want to get to, and then I've got two more other questions to close us off here. It's called "That's Not Funny. We Rise Together by Getting Humor Right." And so I think I'm kind of funny, Sally, but mostly because I'm Canadian, I'm self-deprecating. So everything I do, I make fun of myself. But you write here in the book, which is really fascinating. Today, many jokes have become problematic, serving as flashpoints or ways to distinguish who understands that the culture and the rules are changing and who does not. So you point out that situational awareness is actually also key for us requiring us, to ask whether this is the right time and place for that humorous observation. So in this case, what is it that leaders, team members, both of us should be doing to either be funny, humorous, or even just lighthearted in our various interactions and communications?
Well, self-deprecation works very well, but it particularly works well if you're at a position of influence, authority, and power. It's less fruitful or useful if you're early in your career, because it can be seen as, that self-deprecation. Nobody wants to hear you put yourself down. So it doesn't serve you well. And that's an important distinction, I think, although self-deprecation is extremely successful with anybody in a leadership or senior position. But what I became aware of is there's a problematic nature of jokes. So the people who rely on jokes for humor rather than situational humor, rather than commentary that's not demeaning to other people, in response to a situation. But the joke thing, did you hear the one about that sort of deal? Jokes are inherently transgressive. They rely for their humor upon a juxtaposition that's surprising and transgressive. And the funniest jokes are usually the ones that are most transgressive because their juxtapositions are so surprising. Right. You think they're going in one direction, they go in another direction, which is why so much humor is, ethnic jokes, etc. Well, this stuff, when I was starting out, when I was a speechwriter, which was in the 1980s, this was considered almost essential for executives to have a good a good battery of jokes to tell. And when I was a speechwriter, I would get calls when we were at a conference in Palm Springs. Oh, so and so wants 3 jokes by tomorrow morning. And what I always felt was the guys I was writing for, they felt that if they told a couple jokes in the beginning, then they could be as boring as they wanted to be. So it was really very segmenting. So jokes are increasingly problematic, and people who use them are used to relying on them for humor often get pushback, and they get pushback from women or people of color, gay people, etc., because of that transgressive nature. So one of the things I was talking about there is it's important to stop equating jokes with humor. A lot of times people who continue to tell jokes, well, I'm sorry if that offended anybody. Okay, fine, that's not effective, especially if you continue to use it and do it. It's just kind of a bad idea. So developing that situational awareness, finding the humor and the commonalities is the best approach to humor. And it's very important that we do that, because we do not want to lose humor in the workplace. We really do not. It is one of the most effective ways to bond, to relieve tension, and to bring enjoyment into our work. We want that rich sense of humor without risking the transgression that is vested in many jokes and a lot of sort of witty, sarcastic commentary that no longer has any business in the workplace.
Yeah, and some of those jokes, whether they're meaningfully or unmeaningfully sexist, racist, geographic in nature, end up as being microaggressions unknowingly and unwittingly, creating this angst within the population of the team members or whoever was in the audience. It's like, I know that might have not been intended, but if you had to just stopped and thought through with your empathy, ideally, and some of the other points that you make in the book, that you can harm more than you can create a situation whereby people feel humored by your humor. That's where I took great delight in seeing you recognize that we as leaders have to do a much better job of being proactive in thinking through if, quote, that humor or that joke will land. Like your golf examples, for example, in the book, it's just like, come on, day and age, perhaps in the 80s, that was okay. But let's not do the heart attack joke on the 3rd hole anymore of a golf joke. Let's just stop all of that, right? It's just insane. Okay, my penultimate.
It doesn't work. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. My penultimate sort of area of focus for you is the suggestion, which I think is just delightful, about the informal enlistment of how we must become active enlisters. So can you tell us a little bit about what informal enlistment and becoming an active enlister is, Sally? And then we'll ask you one final question.
Sure. This point of people talk about, how do I build allies? One of the most effective way to build allies is to ask people what they think about something you're doing, about something you're trying to get better at something you may have had negative feedback on. And what we were just talking about is a very good example. Say you have a funny story that you think is funny. Well, don't just think it through yourself. Ask someone. If it involves a woman, go up to a female colleague and say, I think this story is funny. I was thinking of telling it to open this meeting, but I'm not sure. I'd love to get your thoughts about it. Get that from a couple people. Test it out. Or if we're trying to get better at something, say, we've had feedback that we talk over people in meetings. Say we've had feedback that the way in which we speak is not resonant for the younger people in our organization, whatever that is. Or if we don't need feedback, we get a perception. I'm not sure the younger people are really hearing that. Then we want to ask, we want to ask those people. We don't want to just try to figure it out on our own. And it's very, I learned this with How Women Rise. It's very disarming to people to ask them to help you get better at something. Very disarming. Most people are to some degree flattered. We used to recommend it a lot with women who had been told that they weren't very concise. We were talking about before with that, broad spectrum notice, that radar spanning room and a lack of concision. Rather than trying to figure it out, ask somebody. I've had some feedback or I've gotten the feeling that I'm not concise enough in how I present in meetings. I'd like to get better at it. You're really good at it. Is there anything you do? Is there any kind of preparation you go through that could be helpful information to me? I'd really appreciate it. So there you are, you're building your alliances based upon asking people for little tiny micro ways of helping. And it's a really effective way of doing it. And I call the process informal enlistment. It's a kind of on the spot or on the fly peer coaching as well. And the more you can get active at it, if you're a perfectionist, it makes it impossible for you to pretend you're being perfect. Whatever it is, it's really a problem solver that helps in many, many ways.
I love it. Something we all could use for certain. Okay. My last question for you, Sally, perhaps is a bit personal. A couple of years ago, somehow I got thrown into, by the grace of Alan Mulally, the 100 Coaches group, and I've been learning from yourself and others throughout the past 2 years extraordinarily well. And I thank Alan for that. You have had a lifelong, it seems, relationship with the founder of 100 Coaches, which of course is Marshall Goldsmith, and you've dedicated the book to this legendary man. So I was curious, what has Marshall meant to you in that partnership and friendship over the years?
Well, Marshall really has been sort of essential to the development of how people perceive me in the marketplace. I'm a writer. That's what I'm comfortable with. I'm comfortable, writing books and working with words. And I always, I came from a world where the idea was, if you write a good book, people will read it. Well, it's not always necessarily true. I had exposure to Marshall fairly early on. It was when the Web of Inclusion came out, and I'd been asked to give the keynote at a Drucker Foundation event that was out in the San Diego area where Marshall lived at that time. And he invited all of us, everybody at the whole conference, which filled up the big old Coronado.
Sounds like Marshall, right? Yeah.
He invited us all to his house one night. And afterwards, he called me a couple months afterwards, he called me and said, I'm starting a group called the Learning Network. I've been inspired by the Renaissance weekends. I want to bring together people in our field, most of whom work alone, so we don't have a natural colleague network. And I would like you to be part of it. This was in 1995. So I said, I'd love it, because in fact, I felt like I was starving for colleagues. I was going around giving keynotes, working with people who got to work with each other. And then I was flying away and coming home, and that was the rhythm. So I jumped at the chance to develop colleagues. That group is called the Learning Network. It was a very small group, unlike 100 Coaches. We made an early decision not to expand it because we felt we had very intimate conversations. Unfortunately, what it meant was the group got smaller and smaller as we got older and older, and people died. So that's actually an argument against that. But we are celebrating, because it got postponed, our 25th anniversary now. So the Learning Network, in a way, was a forerunner of 100 Coaches. It didn't fulfill Marshall's vision necessarily as something that would, where we would actively promote one another's careers. Although we did, it became a sort of a network of support and recognition, and a place where we could really speak about what was going on in our lives. And I think that was spurred by the participation of the great Bill Bridges, who was a founding member and who was going through some very difficult times, and shared them in a way of almost breathtaking vulnerability. And that shaped the group. And going through Bill's experience and his illness was very profound. So it operated differently. The 100 Coaches, to me, exemplifies a healthy network. And this is what Marshall has been aiming at and trying to create. Of course, Marshall was also instrumental for me, even though I'd written books and had some very successful books like The Female Advantage and Web of Inclusion, in sort of bumping me up in terms of visibility by accepting the suggestion that we collaborate on How Women Rise, and then pouring himself fully and wholeheartedly into the promotion and making that book the global phenomenon it's become. So that was another aspect of it. And I was influenced by what got you here won't get you there. But I recognize that the habits and behaviors he focuses on in that book, they can serve you well early, but not as you move into leadership, were not necessarily the habits that were holding women back, like learn to apologize, or don't always talk about how great you are. No, that's not. So that's why I suggested to him, that we collaborate on this book that took that model, but looked specifically at women. And what was really interesting, Dan, is when I made that proposal to him, I was very reluctant to do it because I thought he was going to think, see, this is really about leveraging. This is a great story about leveraging. I assumed that what Marshall would think was, oh, I see. Okay, she's trying to build on my 1.5 LinkedIn followers, 1.5 million LinkedIn followers. Yeah. Oh, I see. She's trying to, I wrote a New York Times bestseller, so she's trying to ride on my coattails. It wasn't what he thought at all. What he said was, what a great idea. I've had feedback from women that they don't identify with these behaviors. And also, more and more of my audiences, there are more and more women in them. And I need credibility with women. And I think working with you would give me a lot of credibility with women. So this was a very good lesson about leveraging, and also about informal enlistment, that, ask for what you want. It may be serving what other people are looking for as well.
An incredible life and career professional lesson. Thank you so much for that insight and vulnerability yourself, for sort of explaining the history and just the rapport and love, obviously, that you have for Mr. Goldsmith. Of note, just before I ask you this final question, where we can learn more about you, you didn't title the book Rising Up, which I appreciated. You titled it Rising Together. You could most easily title it Rising Up, i.e. a way in which for us all to rise up. But Rising Together suggests that we are equals. We're just human to human, trying to make a difference in each other's lives, hopefully for the better. How we can bridge divides and create a more inclusive workplace is just a brilliant subtitle as well. So, Sally, where can we find more about you and the book?
Well, the book is everywhere. Any place you want to go. You want to go to Amazon, you want to go to Barnes & Noble, you want to go to your bookstore. About me, my website, sallyhelgesen.com, it has a contact button. And I got, multiple emails a day through that contact button, and I respond to them. And I am on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I also have a Substack newsletter called All Rise, and that comes out every Wednesday, and is also posted after it goes live on Substack. And there's of course a connect button on my website. It goes live on LinkedIn right after it's posted on Substack. So lots of ways to get in touch with me.
Amazing. Well, this has just been a true honor and privilege. Can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me about such a wonderful book, Rising Together. And everything that you've done in your career is just one awesomeness point after another. Thank you for doing what you do to leave this world a better place for those that are in leadership and non-leadership roles, because you're making such a dent, and you certainly have impacted many people for the better. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Dan. I really enjoyed our conversation together.
Amazing. Okay, folks, that was another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract, the one, the only Sally Helgesen, with Rising Together, how we can bridge divides and create a more inclusive workplace. Take care, everyone.